IVM.
Why is it so difficult to run a restaurant in India? And why haven't governments like the government of Karnataka given out a single new liquor license in years? And what does this mean for the cost of your food? This week on the Pragati podcast, we try and understand how restaurants and dining out is changing in India and how governments often get in the way of this with arcane laws.
Welcome to the Pragati podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. We are your hosts, Hamsini Hariharan
and Pawan Srinath. To talk about all things restaurants, we are joined today by Manu Chandra and Madhu Menon. Chef Manu Chandra is a household name to pretty much anyone who cares about food and cuisine in Bangalore. He is an alumnus of the Culinary Institute of America in New York and has been running a host of amazing restaurants in India. He is chef partner at Toast and Tonic, The Fatty Bao and Monkey Bar, and an executive chef at Olive Beach. Madhu Menon is my colleague at Pragati who has many hats, including that of a chef. Madhu is a restaurant consultant, a food writer, and a food photographer. And he used to run a restaurant called Shiok, a Far Eastern cuisine restaurant in Bangalore. We'll be back with Madhu and Manu to talk about restaurants after this short break.
Hey everybody, welcome to another week on IVM Podcast. If you are not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Also, I wanted to ask everybody, it would be really great if you could recommend a show that you like to a friend. That's the way that we're going to spread the word about podcasting. Please go ahead and do that. This week on Cyrus Says, we have film critic Rajiv Masan. Cyrus and Rajiv discuss films they grew up on, the allure of movie stars, and the bright future of Indian films. On Simplified, Chuck, Naren, and Sriket tell us about eco-friendly Ganeshas and how Ganpati immersions can be more environmentally friendly. On The Seen and the Unseen, Amit speaks to Yazad Jal, a fellow for economic policy at the Takshashila Institute, about India's ongoing job crisis. On the Pragati podcast, lawyer and policy analyst Amaya Nayak joins Pawan and Hamsini to discuss the Syrian civil war that has killed 500,000 people and displaced more than 10 million Syrians. This week on Paisa Vaisa, Anupam talks to Deepak Shenoy. Deepak's the founder of Capital Mind, and they discuss portfolio management schemes. The Rediscovery Project is coming out with its 4th season. Don't forget to catch Ambika and Hoshna with all new episodes from the 25th of September. And with that, let's go on with the shows.
Welcome back. Hi Manu, welcome to the Pragati podcast. And hi Madhu, it's the first time we are having you here, though you've been running the Pragati website for a long time. Today we could talk about what's happening in the restaurant and the dining scene in India. India is an odd country where people still prefer to eat their meals at home, and restaurants are still a dining out experience. So that's how it was even 10 or 15 years ago. So I'm curious to know what all has happened since. And eventually I think we'll get to what kind of a role government is playing in all of this and how maybe they can get out of the way better. But before that, Manu, could you tell us a little about what all you have done in the food scene?
Oh, wow.
Small ask.
Well, yes. So I've definitely been a part of that 15-year process in India where the classical definition of food or dining was limited only to the home. There's been a paradigm shift in that entire thing in the last decade and a half. So I'm a trained chef, and I opened my first restaurant in Bangalore, even though I'm not from here. Nearly 15 years ago, Olive Beach, and it's still there. So we sort of, shirked that trend and just kept doing that for a very long time. And about 7 years ago, we branched off into doing different verticals or different other kinds of products which we felt fit the prevailing market a lot better. The so-called millennial trend, etc. Essentially, more all-encompassing product rather than sticking to something which was a lot finer. And we then opened Monkey Bar and Fatty Bao. Of late, we opened Toast and Tonic. These are all the Bangalore brands, but we also have Soda Bottle Opener Wala.
Okay.
We have Guppy, which is a Japanese vertical that we have in Bombay and Delhi, and a bunch of other verticals within the larger company. And so we're at about 36 restaurants now across the country, and doing all kinds of interesting stuff.
And Madhu, you've had a very eclectic journey in this as well, right?
Yeah, at any given point of time, I'm doing a bunch of different things. Actually, my background is in IT, so I studied computer science, and I just had an interest in cooking since I was 13. So, and at that time, in the 90s, there wasn't much by way of training in India. It was basically Institute of Hotel Management, and I had really no interest in cleaning rooms or making beds, which is part of the whole course. I just wanted to cook. After talking to a lot of professionals in the business, I said, okay, let's not do this as professionally. Let's do the other thing I like. So I went abroad to study. I came back and I worked in the IT sector for 7 years, 8 years, and I was, working independently for a bit as a user experience consultant. And a lot of the time I was making food for people, because I get bored cooking for myself. And all of these folks used to come and say, hey, you're in the wrong line of work. You should be starting a restaurant. And my favorite food is Southeast Asian. So there wasn't much of that at all in 2002 or so. Of course, Manu himself runs a bunch of those restaurants now, so the scene has completely changed. But back then there wasn't much, and something possessed me to go start a restaurant, which I ran for 7 years. And fortunately, I shut it down in 2010. After that, I took a small sabbatical. Then I started consulting for restaurants and setting up menus for them and stuff like that. I also do food photography. It came out of a interaction with my photographer friend who taught me a lot, and then I just liked food, so for me those two go together pretty well. So that's what I've been doing, and of course, as you know, on the side I also manage the Pragati website, because to me that's a worthy cause and I enjoy doing it.
So what all do you think has changed in the last 15, 20 years in India? Nowadays a lot of news focuses on what's happening online, right? So food delivery is taken off. I think Zomato has come on the scene where, discoverability of restaurants is better. But that to me is still just looking at the last few years. Can you take us back from when you both started and what all has happened since then in the food scene in India?
India is very broad to be able to cover in one podcast, but
we can also focus on Bangalore, right?
Just to give you an example of Bangalore, I think when we were starting out, when we came scouting for locations here, it was unbelievable. I fell in love with the city immediately because it was chilled out. It was great weather. There was barely any restaurants. UB City was still in the foundation stage. Sunny's had just opened their new outlet on Lavelle Road, or was about to open. If I remember correctly. There wasn't very much in way of interesting dining options. There was a few tried and tested iconic spaces, as they call them now. But it was a very fledgling market. So I wasn't sure if we would meet any commercial success, and we didn't for the first 2 years, actually. But we were bailed out essentially back then by a very large expat crowd who was craving, something closer to home or more familiar, and that's really where it started to now, when you have entire areas which have become restaurant hubs. From of course, UB City was one of the first ones, but that was more a mall format. But Indranagar, Kormangla, Kamanhalli, JP Nagar, it just goes on, and that's really what's happened in the last 15 years. It's not just the restaurant that's exploded, the cities have.
Right.
And I'm sure our population in Bangalore must have nearly doubled in that time period. That in itself creates tremendous opportunity, and entrepreneurs from across the country moved into Bangalore very quickly. I think every time they see in any city, if there's a major player moving in, it gives other people a lot more confidence in saying, and especially if they see it meet with any commercial success, they think the time is right. That was till about 5 years ago. What's happened in the last 5 years is a completely different story altogether, where, this explosion in the food space has happened at every level and every vertical, not only in the restaurant space, but the allied spaces which feed off the restaurants.
All right.
And for all their, unicorn valuations, etc., you have to realize that all these companies are parasitic at some level onto the restaurant business, and the restaurant business now feel most antagonized by them, which is, of course, a different thing I'm sure Madhu can elaborate on further.
They would probably say symbiotic, but hey, parasitic works.
I call it parasitic because there's always so much angst. Especially when you open up, we saw it with Yelp in the US, and it just creates a very negative environment. And I'm not picking on any one company particularly because this is a malaise that sort of transcends a singular company. Audits are very important, and trying to run businesses responsibly are very important, both for the restaurant as well as aggregators or review sites, etc. And I think the largest complaint, which we can always get to later, we were just talking about what's happened in the last 10 years and then 5 years added on, so that basically totals up to 15. The last 5 years have really boomed, and it's because of this propensity to consume outside interesting offerings which you would never be able to get at home. Dal chawal is not the cool thing to eat for a lot of people now because there's availability and there's choice, and there could be an n number of reasons for it. There's so many PGs now. No one wants to sit at home and eat whatever is being given to them at the PG. There's no intonation actually, and that's
Right.
really why. And it's affordable now. I mean, the consumer and the customer is actually on the winning side on this one because the deals that you get right now are just unbelievable. For a couple of $100, you can probably have a drink and something to eat and be home, which didn't happen in the early days because it just didn't.
Right.
Scale, competition, sponsorships, everything has made that. Trying to drive economies of scale has made that possible because real estate has definitely kept up. It's become ridiculously expensive to run a restaurant. Own any kind of, forget ownership. Very few people own the properties they run restaurants in. We're not in the real estate business. It's essentially leasing. So when the nature of the city has changed in itself, all this is bound to follow. And that is true across the country in many ways. Delhi, you can see, has become at least 3 or 4 satellite cities. And then, the main city itself. Calcutta is seeing complete resurgence after a 15-year lull.
Okay.
And Bombay has always been, of course, a conglomeration of lots of microcosms. And, for Fatty Bao, we have 4 in one city in Bombay because each area can actually afford to feed in to that kind of, we bank on that kind of demand and we do get it. And there are people who have so many more. So, I mean, it's really, like I said earlier, there's been a paradigm shift from 15 years ago. It's incomparable right now.
Right. And not only the number of people increasing and the incomes of people increasing, but people want to spend more on food, right? Food is these cliche things about do you eat to live or live to eat and all of that. But it's very evident that people want to spend on food and that will give them either joy or...
You have to look at it a little more holistically because it's not just about spending on food. It's about spending on the overall experience.
Right.
The fact that you can actually get out of work and now catch up with your colleagues for a drink. I mean, you have an office right above one of the most popular places in town. I'm sure you guys step down after work, grab a bite to eat, get a drink, and then say your good nights.
Yeah.
So it's a lot about that. And when the nature of the beast has changed in itself, the way the businesses are run or are opened are bound to follow. And that's really what we're seeing. So Bangalore was always called the pub city, and I think it continues to hold that title because I think we have more pubs and microbreweries and gastropubs and bars than any other city per capita.
Yeah, it used to be just Kingfisher Draft earlier, the old school.
And
pubs.
classic rock from the 70s playing in all of them.
I think that's still there.
That's still the
It's
case,
like,
I think. Yeah.
India doesn't think there's any rock music beyond the 70s, but hey, that's a different topic altogether. But now, of course, like you said, microbreweries, everyone has their own brew, some good, some not so good. But hey, I like the fact that there's so much options out there. And if you don't like a place, you can always go to another one. And it's probably just a few steps down the road anyway.
So, can you tell us a little bit about the back end of running restaurants and pubs and so on? Like, how is it like to get the right kind of food that you need? I mean, India's supply chains is still all fragmented. How is it to get good talent to run as, chefs, as, people who are in the services and so on? Can you tell us a little about that?
See, we're an aspirational market, and we will continue to be so for a very long time. And we call ourselves a developing economy, obviously. The end goal for a lot of people are very different here. And talent has been a struggle from the word go, 15 years ago and even now. For the longest time, for people in the hospitality sector, so to speak, the only bona fide employment option was five-star hotels.
Right.
So most of the talent used to go into that. And that's why restaurants per se struggled a lot more in being able to find talented chefs. And that's why you would have always seen that we had a lot more owner-driven restaurants, or chefs were owners of restaurants. And that was everywhere, not only in Bangalore, but across the country. In fact, some of the best-known restaurants, let's say when I came back to India, I lived in New York for a while, were people like Rahul Akerkar at Indigo, Ritu Dalmia in Delhi. There was just a handful of chefs doing really interesting work, which could be compared to what was happening globally at some level. And it's really after all these years, if you see a lot of their understudies, etc., or sous chefs have now risen up the ranks and either opened their own or leading large groups of restaurants. And that's true. It peters down across the hierarchy. And here the move from being a trainee cook to being an entrepreneur, it's a very short sort of timeline.
That's a good thing, right?
It's not actually, because you can't really, and that's why you have such high failure rates.
Okay.
Just because you learn 5 recipes doesn't really make you adept at running an entire business or being a great chef or being innovative enough to constantly create stuff, handle the supply chain, etc. So the aspirational value sometimes turns out to also be our greatest enemy in this field largely. But it also opens up the doors, and that's where, the hospitality business, the restaurant business specifically, is a great gateway for employment for the unemployable. People from across the country will start moving in, and you see it now everywhere, not only in Bangalore. Again, you can go to Chennai, you can go to Cochin, you can go wherever, and you will see that a lot of kids from the Northeast, from Bengal, from Madhya Pradesh, from Bihar, from UP, from Andhra, they're all flocking to cities, and one of the easiest places they can find employment is the restaurant space. And
it's also a vehicle for people to learn English.
Oh, absolutely. Many things.
And most of them start off knowing
skills.
nothing, really.
Right.
It's not like they were trained anywhere. So they pretty much work their way up the ranks. And like you said, that's a good thing. Eventually, bottle washers all end up becoming, say, assistant cooks, and then they rise the ranks that way. So they literally start off washing dishes, and then they start chopping a few things, and then maybe making a few pastes and sauces, and then they start maybe making a few starters, and then eventually in a few years they learn stuff.
Unlike so many other sectors where you need a degree to even get a foot in the door, and
Absolutely.
then you climb a certain ladder.
It's the same thing in US as well. It's a lot of the staff are immigrants, and they work really hard. And the late Anthony Bourdain has documented this pretty well. He's talked about
And I guess the hospitality sector is a great first job to have in a city once you've moved in, right? And then you can decide whether this is where you want to be or if you want to move on to other spaces.
Some of those folks are moving because they need something, right? And this is one of those sectors that keeps them employed. And I don't know if they have a lot of choice in that they can go and join a call center or something like that. But on the flip side, they do tend to work hard at it because they need it. So there's that. Yeah.
And it's more stable that way. I mean, the call center jobs move to Philippines very quickly, right?
Right.
I mean,
The restaurant
jobs
doesn't move.
won't.
That's true. You can't have someone outsource your dinner to Philippines.
Right. So in a way, it's very locally grounded.
I just like to add something to what Manu said about these people who start off, trainees and then work their way up to starting their own restaurants. You have no idea how many people come to me, Pawan, and say, "Oh, I want to start a restaurant because I love food so much, or I love cooking so much." And I tell them, "No, you do not. You believe me. You think cooking for 4 people is fun. When you have to cook for 40 people, 50 people at a stretch, it is not fun anymore. It is really hectic, and you're not cut
and
out
it's
for it.
something else, right?
Yeah, it's not even the same. Just because you like food doesn't mean you have it in you to run a restaurant. There's a whole lot more that goes on behind the scenes, and cost management. Let me put it this way: it's a non-stop stress generator, and it doesn't close, right? You don't have holidays, you don't have Christmas holidays or New Year off, whatever. The days other people have holidays, you're probably working extra hard, like the weekends and Valentine's Day and all that. And so it's a living embodiment of Murphy's Law. On any given day, anything can go wrong. Two of your chefs haven't turned up, or the air conditioning in one section of your restaurant broke down, and people aren't going to stick around for you to fix that, right?
Right.
That'll take a couple of days. So yeah,
And it's so easy to upset people.
it is.
compared
That's.
to
I think we should
We
talk
are
about
easily upsettable people. So
given the explosion of this scene, right? And clearly, not only is it generating income and therefore actually contributing significantly to India's economy as well.
Yeah.
You're creating an enormous number of jobs.
yeah.
I mean, we are estimating that India needs about 20 million jobs to be created year on year on year. And I'm guessing that a lot of that will come from hospitality, from food processing, and from related sectors.
I'd go out on a limb and say I think nearly 5 to 10% of it could come from the sector.
Absolutely. So, given the national importance of this, apart from the personal importance this has to most of us, how has the government sort of been looking at this at the broadest level? How does a government treat a restaurant owner?
Oh, they've been looking at it gleefully, rubbing their hands in joy and saying, wow, payday. Because that's really what it's turning out to be. The restaurants are soft targets, and it stems from the fact that it's largely an unstructured business.
Mm-hmm.
So unity is always an issue. Unlike substantial lobbies in other industries, be it even the jewelers, for example. I remember recently when something went down with the tax with the jewelers, they all just shut shop.
Right.
That will never happen in the restaurant business, unfortunately. And this isn't a call to arms, but it is what exposes us to a lot of unnecessary harassment, a lot of red tape. There is no form which I can go and collect from any government office which teaches me or tells me how to open a restaurant. If I want a restaurant with liquor, then God help me, because that's just another game altogether. And
You have to be a masochist if you want to start a bar in the city or this country, for that matter.
And there are just a huge number of contradictory laws, or laws that are pulled out from old rule books and then imposed on this new paradigm, right?
Can
whatever
you give us a
existed
few
in the
examples?
70s, let's say the current impasse right now, there's a new notification which would actually, it started in 99, it basically exploded in 2005, essentially as a measure by the then police commissioner or the then polity to curb the very large number of dance bars that existed in Bangalore urban specifically, which then got contested by them. It was upheld in the High Court. It was moved to the Supreme Court, and finally 2018, 13 years later, the Supreme Court basically upheld the order. The Supreme Court did not pass any law, which is, the Supreme Court can't pass any law. And that's really is getting thrown around by people and saying that the Supreme Court has passed the law. I said, no, they can't pass the law. They just upheld the law.
It's common. I mean, this thing that he's referring to, I see it all the time in news reports, that the police commissioner is helplessly saying the Supreme Court has passed the order, but this is not true. It's outright wrong. It's a lie. So
the Supreme Court has just said that the police have the right to issue this.
Yes, that's pretty much it. So anything that's going on right now is squarely in the in the court of the police department and the government of the day.
But tell us a little more what the ostensible problem they were trying to solve was. These are places
like I said, because it's come back 13 years later, the scenario is very different. We just a little while ago explained to you what happened in the last 5 years, let alone the last 13 years. When it was upheld, essentially, which was very recently, it was January of this year, the police commissioner's office basically turned around and said, now this is applicable to anybody who wants to, as per that rule, play any sort of music. So if you want to play music, it could be live music, it could be a DJ, it could be piped music, recorded music, needs to apply for a license. There's no music ban, but in effect it is, because to obtain the types of paperwork that have been asked for are not virtually, they are impossible. Which is, again, this is where the contradictions come into play, right? Because when you open a restaurant, you go to the local civic body and saying that I want to open a restaurant. I need to apply for a trade license. I need to apply for a food safety license. I need to apply for all kinds of other things. And they come and they check your premises, including excise, and they issue your licenses. Now, suddenly you're told that you need an occupancy certificate, which was never really under the purview of the restaurant owner. It was always the landlord.
Okay.
And there was no document that, or no license that we needed to ever apply for, which required an occupancy certificate.
Right.
So one just assumed that you were in a premises which was legit.
Right. And you had a contract with the landowner.
And
right?
you had a registered lease deed.
And
Exactly.
and the landowner is paying property tax as well. So as far
At
as the
commercial rates.
at commercial rates,
commercial
so
rates,
the
yes.
BBMP has legitimized that property. Otherwise, why collect tax from it? Just say no, you can't stand. Bring
Absolutely.
it down, but no, you can't have it both ways. Right?
So now there's something new called the occupancy certificate.
Yeah, and that's something about 80% of the buildings in Bangalore don't have. And
Okay.
the reasons for it are simply BBMP bylaws, which have certain requirements for setbacks and things like that, which make it very difficult to obtain. So you have to ask yourself, why is it that something that is supposedly so important is not there, not in like 10% of the buildings, but 80% of the buildings? So there must be something that makes it impractical, right? And that's usually the aim of a lot of these regulations, is to create enough ambiguity or make it impractical that someone has to, let's say, expedite the process by helping in revenue generation. Are those enough euphemisms for you?
So that's the weapon now? The occupancy certificate
Well,
is one of the weapons?
it's not a weapon. It's just there, and so is the fire NOC. Now we are completely for, as an industry, working towards as much fire safety as possible, but it needs to be rationalized. It just cannot be this old docket that's pulled out from somewhere,
Right.
which was framed for very large commercial establishments, and then copy pasted to a 2-story, 3-story, tiny little building on a 60 by 80 plot,
Right.
and saying you need this level of compliance. Even the fire guys would laugh at it, because the amount of compliance required for that would eat up half your property.
Okay. Or like a full extra staircase and all kinds of...
Extra staircase is a perfectly legitimate request.
Okay.
But when you have no setbacks and one building is built next to the other constantly, where are you going to put that staircase? Unless they, give us some kind of solution like New York has, right? It always has towards the front of the building, because New York also had the same issue. Every building was built next to each other. There's no setbacks in New York per se.
Mm-hmm.
The second issue is that you need to have X amount of water tank capacity on top as well as in the ground. Now, if you see the square foot requirement of an underground tank on an already built building, it's impossible. You can't dig out your ground floor and then suddenly put a tank over there, right? It's impossible.
Right.
But it's required by that list. So who's going to rationalize it? The fire department needs to rationalize it. And some of the fire guys will, off the record, even tell you guys have enough in terms of fire safety measures. From two-way speakers, alarm systems, smoke detectors, sprinkler systems, fire hoses, you name it. All of it is there, including exits. That's enough. That usually is enough anywhere in the world. But this old rule is now going to be applied. Now, to be able to play music, even recorded music, I need both the fire NOC and NOC. They both not virtually, like I said, they are impossible.
So you can serve food without this.
Absolutely.
Which is ironic, right? You'd think a restaurant would require the same NOC, right? I mean, it's just a crippled fire. But no, it's only for bars and playing recorded music. Why does recorded music impose an additional requirement for safety? I don't know.
So I guess music and sound makes places more flammable, right? Or makes people more flammable.
But it's okay. I mean, there's an exceptions list in which I can play a certain kind of classical music. I can play Yakshagana. So there's... one's got to wonder, is this just some larger moral policing issue and a little bit of judicial overreach? Because I can blast Yakshagana remixes and have everyone dancing and still be a hazard at many levels, right? So it really needs a little thinking through by the polity in place, saying, okay, we are getting a little ridiculous. The impacts have been immediate. Because what's the first thing that's going to be impacted is going to be the excise revenue. Now, do understand that, and I'm sure you can know a separate podcast on that alone, is that the excise revenue is the second largest contributor to the exchequer in the state.
Absolutely.
It should, I think, if all stays well and on track, it should breach the 20,000 crore mark this year. I think 90 to 95% of that comes from the city of Bangalore.
Right.
You are compromising that. All the indirect taxes and direct taxes are going to disappear that this industry pays, from GST, excessive GST on rent, income tax, you name it. What is the end goal? It's impossible for us to determine right now. I mean, what's at play? It makes no sense.
But when you also have to ask yourself, what is the ostensible aim of these regulations? I mean, what are they supposed to achieve? Is crime supposed to go down? Are people supposed to be safer? And I mean, all you're doing really is putting a whole lot of musicians, DJs, and restaurants out of business. And restaurants already are a tough business to be in. The investment amount required is in crores. It used to be tens of lakhs earlier, but now it's in crores. And like you said earlier, people are not going just for food; they're going for experiences. And what kind of experience is it that you go to a restaurant and it's completely quiet and you just have a drink and there's no ambience to speak of, right? I mean, it's pointless. If you're not selling alcohol, if your sales are down by 50%, which is what I'm hearing at a lot of places, your excise department revenues already hit. And on top of that, the excise department also has a mandatory minimum that you need to sell every month, your quota. And if you don't, you can be fined. So see the additional cost of all this compliance, right? It's completely bonkers.
Right.
So let's say that I have all my paperwork in place. I'm one of those few lucky buggers who has an OC and a fire NOC.
Okay.
Or let's say I have a building which is pre-1976, in which case I don't need a OC. I need structural clearance from the department, the local department, right? What next? Then I have to go to the commissioner's office. I have to fill in the application. I have to furnish all the documents. Then I am told that now that you have furnished all the documents, you need to take an ad in the newspaper out, vernacular as well as English, in the leading dailies, asking if there are any objections from the public at large or any organization for this particular establishment to play music.
Wow.
If there are no objections received in the next 2 weeks, it should be good and we will give you a license for 1 year. Meanwhile, if you put the ad in the paper also, which means you follow through to the next step, the traffic police department is going to show up and check whether you have enough parking in your establishment, if you are not a parking hazard in any way, or stopping traffic, etc. And whether you have an in and an out gate. Please name me 20 restaurants in the city which would have that. Or 20 areas that would have it. I mean, the only people who would probably have that is the 5-star hotel.
Right.
So, I mean, this is really where it leads to next. Net, it's going back to the same old point, which is ostensibly what is the end goal of this one? It seems to be self-destruction of the exchequer, nothing else.
I mean, seems like we're going towards sort of what Chennai has been for a while, right? I'm sure it's changing now. This idea that you could only go drink at a 5-star restaurant or at the local Tasmac. I mean, Bangalore was a place which was not like that, right? And I mean, we were
It's supposed to be a liberal, quote-unquote, city, right? And the pub city, all that.
That's become a dirty word now, right? So we're not going to use the word liberal.
Anyway. But we had pubs way back, and now finally, after much lobbying, they actually changed the closing hours from 11:30 to 1:30. So things have changed, but this makes no sense.
To me, the larger thing about how especially the local government deals with businesses has been largely missing from the conversation as well, right? Even what little conversation happens in the policy spaces around cities is about cities and public service delivery, right? How do you provide slightly better roads, slightly better water supply, and so on. All of that is geared towards the citizens. But the citizens of any city spend an inordinate amount of time engaging with businesses, sitting in restaurants, working in offices,
Correct.
Being in other establishments which are of a commercial nature. And if the city cannot engage businesses well, and all modern cities outside India engage businesses well, right? Because businesses bring in jobs, businesses bring in revenue, taxes, and make the city flourish. So I think, to me, while this is clearly there is an issue of, who scratches whose back, and a and a messed up political economy in place locally, this larger conversation of cities which speak to their businesses and hear and listen to their businesses is something that I think is a conversation that is yet to be started in India.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at just the ease of doing business across the country,
There is no ease, I'm sorry.
other cities at least are trying proactively. I wouldn't say all of them, but some of them are definitely trying proactively to woo our industry in through either single window clearances, reducing the number of licenses. Bombay used to have 40 licenses required. It came down to 20, 10 of which could be got from the same department. Life was simplified. That is when Bombay's restaurant scene exploded. Real estate in Bombay is preposterous now. It's hit some 450 rupees a square foot in some areas.
This is a rental, right?
Rental.
Wow.
Yes, imagine. And there are parts of the state where you can probably buy property at that price, but there's tax being paid on it. Where it's going, I mean, it's the richest municipal corporation in the country for
Absolutely.
a reason.
And Bangalore is one of the poorest. I mean, our budget still struggles to cross 5,000 crores, and we are already have more than 1 crore people. So we are talking about...
And take excise in itself. I mean, such a large contributor to the exchequer. We've already established that. And these are large posters you will see in the excise office itself. It's not something that I'm concocting over here. They're very proud of the fact that they collect such large
and Karnataka
revenues.
is one of the largest excise revenues in the country.
Absolutely. But if you look at it overall, if you look at it as from a national perspective, most states which have more relaxed liquor policies, I mean, obviously not Gujarat and Bihar, etc., you will see that nearly 18 to 22% of revenues are coming from excise. So excise is always, and that's why it's always a state mandated subject. They wouldn't let go of this. This is their cash cow.
And especially now with GST going into sort of state plus union, a joint thing, excise is one thing that the states have some amount of control over.
Exactly. So you take that and ask them when was the last time they issued a new liquor license. There wasn't any.
1993.
So they're not issuing new liquor licenses. Excise revenue is still going up. Yeah. So there is liquor being consumed, right? It's because the number of people have gone up. The younger population is definitely up. The millennials, so to speak, and more. There is a lot of consumption. But why this racket of not issuing new licenses? Would that not make things legitimized? Would it not be easier to track what's happening? Of course it would be. But does it happen? No, it doesn't. There's some sinister thing at play over there, which I really don't know.
It's a moralistic thing, honestly. It's a moralistic... they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. So the moralistic thing is that you only issue X number of licenses per units of population, right? To prevent people from drinking too much. At the same time, like you pointed out, it's the biggest, one of the biggest revenue generators for government. So what do you do?
So it goes back to goes back to this idea, right? That while we have food safety regulation, it does everything but regulate food safety, right? There are enough restaurants in town where eating food is actually a fairly unsafe activity.
The purpose of most regulation is actually harassment, honestly. It's discretionary, right? And regulations are formed in such a way that they could pretty much pick one piece of cauliflower that accidentally fell off your counter and say that you're a health hazard. So all that's needed to shut down your restaurant. And the biggest problem in the restaurant business is that there's no do-over, right? If you had to close for some reason for a day, you have lost that entire day's revenue and you don't ever get it back. And that's quite a chunk of money.
And you don't necessarily lose that day's costs.
Yeah, so the costs you are basically being blackmailed. And they hold all the power. So the legal, you might go to court and win after 6 months maybe. But then what happens in the meantime? And Manu knows this, unfortunately. What happened last year with all the MG Road fiasco, but the highways and all that. That revenue is never coming back. And I think restaurants are some of the most... in terms of compliance, the amount of documentation required is staggering. I mean, I don't think retail has that kind of thing. It's maybe construction has, but it's just crazy how many departments and how many people you have to get approvals from and keep them happy on an ongoing basis. So every time you hear people, talk about how expensive booze is getting, you have to realize there have been no fresh licenses issued in 25 years. And the number of licenses in the city has been constant. So classic economics, basically, you have a fixed supply and rising demand. So what's happening is that you have to buy it from someone else, and that guy in turn extracts quite a bit of money from you,
Right.
because that's an asset now. You never thought a license would be an asset, but it is.
Like the taxi medallions in New York a while ago,
Basically.
right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's going to crows now. It used to be 8.5, 9 lakhs in 2003 when I set up my place. And now it's, I don't know the latest figure, but I'm sure it's like a crore and a half. Now imagine a person having to get a crore and a half just to get a license from someone. And that's before even going to the excise department and transferring it into his name. Those costs, where do they go? They go get passed on as higher costs
Right.
to you, the prices to you.
Which is why sometimes drinks in Bangalore will be the same cost as drinks in cities.
I found a cheaper drink in Europe often.
Yeah.
So, and New York sometimes. And New York is not a cheap place to drink.
We're basically effectively changing the nature of restaurants because of all this silly red tape and rising costs. To be able to make a buck in the prevailing scenario, you have no choice but to focus on liquor sales. You have no choice but to add more volume. You have no choice but to bank on economies of scale, even if you're a unstructured small venture. Because you walk into a pub and it's packed, it's not necessarily because the person is genuinely enjoying having more patrons that they can handle. That's the only way they're going to be able to rake up some numbers. To rationalize the cost of a forbiddingly expensive license, to rationalize the cost of increased payouts to their employees and real estate. So you'll basically become a pub city and nothing else. What will happen to poor restaurants who are trying to serve only good food? It'll be impossible. Why is that happening? Because these commercial zones where a lot of these pubs, etc., are sprouting is essentially where people can get to easily. Right, there's access. So city planning has basically facilitated areas like these to become the centers of F&B. And for them to be able to rationalize the costs, they need to be able to sell more liquor, and that's why they're bustling. It could be like any street in London or anywhere else in Europe or Southeast Asia, anywhere really. Sri Lanka for that matter.
Or Goa.
Or Goa. I mean, Goa, of course, is a lot more spread out now,
Right.
and lots of little centers have taken over, but how do you win this? There is no win in this situation. And the burden of policing also now comes onto the restaurant.
Right.
How many things can you be? If you have only 1 or 2 patrol cars in an entire area with, lakhs of people living there and hundreds of restaurants, things will bound to go off at some point. If you drink too much and you walk up, 5 streets in London and create a ruckus, is the restaurant owner going to come and chase you down and find and see what you're doing, or would it be effective policing in the area?
Right.
And there's obviously some citizen responsibility also. You don't expect every, to be bumping into yubs every day in London. It doesn't happen like that. And I'm using London as just one random example, right?
Right.
So making the whole business unviable is really what the environment has become, given the fact that it's, become so large and substantial. It can be catastrophic if there isn't some very serious public policy change, or at least change in the thought
Reform,
process,
basically, yeah.
and reform especially, which organizations like the National Restaurant Association of India and others, of course, the hotels have their own bodies, are trying to work towards engaging with policy makers to try to simplify things for everybody.
And modernize them for the 21st century, right?
Completely, because like I said, this is the new paradigm. The nature of going out has changed fundamentally. To see a grandmother celebrating her 70th birthday at a pub is not an uncommon sight anymore. It would have been, something that would have made the papers 15 years ago, but that's the new normal. If they're not going to accept the new normal, then, essentially that's an ostrich syndrome. Keep collecting the money, but keep saying that nothing has changed.
We are in 2018. It's high time we realize that we need laws and policies that can govern modern cities. So on that note, thank you so much, Madhu. Thank you so much, Madhu, for coming on the Pragati podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Have you back here once maybe some of these things start changing, and I hope to have you back here.
Well, I
in a
hope that
year
actually
or so.
happens, because then that'll be a nice podcast to do. That something actually has changed because of this.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions for our guests or us hosts, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com.
Thank you for staying with us till the end.
Visit our website at thinkpragati.com for your daily dose of brain fodder on all things public policy.
You can subscribe to the Pragati podcast on the IVM podcast app or wherever else you get your podcasts from. We're there everywhere.
Every week comes a show where three people come together to tell you about stuff they like. A movie, a TV show, a book, and other stuff. Tune in every Monday on the IVM podcast app to IVM Likes. Batman approves this message. Thank you, Batman.
Did I just catch you on your way to work? Or did you end up pulling an all-nighter? Let me guess. You have a packed schedule for the day, the week, and probably the month and the year. That's a lot for your mind to handle, don't you think? This buzzing chaos also brings tons of negative thoughts. Am I right? Try spinning that bottle in a positive direction with me, Chetna, on the Positively Unlimited podcast, every Monday on IBM Podcasts. It's time to change your life one alphabet at a time.